I'm assuming that by now you've taken the first quiz. Right? The key point I want to emphasize is that it's usually not enough to state why you think that the other person's argument is wrong. If you want your readers to get the point of your objection, you usually need to clarify 4 things. First, exactly what claim in the other person's argument you want to criticize. Second, the role that the claim you want to criticize played in the other person's argument. Was the thing you're criticizing supposed to show that something was true, or explain why something else was a good reason to believe that something was true? Third, the reason why you think the other person's argument is wrong. And fourth, why the reason that you give in C, that is, the reason to think the other person's argument is wrong, is a good reason to believe that the other person's argument is wrong. Okay. So if we look at the case with Harry Potter, right? In that case, it's an exception because it was a certain type of conversation. But in a piece of writing, he couldn't just say, Lord Voldemort is out there. He'd have to say, okay, well, you're saying this. I don't think it's true, right? Because Lord Voldemort is out there. And here's why the fact that Lord Voldemort is out there is a reason to believe that what you're saying is not true. At this point, I want to give a warning. Right? An objection is not necessarily an argument for the claim that the conclusion of the original argument is false. Right? An objection is an argument for the claim that something is wrong with the original argument. It could be the conclusion. It could be a piece of evidence. It could be warrant for a piece of evidence. It could be the conclusion, but it might be something else. Right? So, for example, right, think of any story where there's a town gossip. And someone says, I hear that this business is about to go bankrupt. And you say, well, why do you believe that? And the person says, well, the town gossip told me. Right? You might say, look, I don't know if the business is going bankrupt or not, but the fact that the town gossip told it to you is not a reason to believe it. Right? The town gossip repeats every rumor he hears, right? So just ignore him. Okay. That's the idea, right? Now you might come back and say, you know what? Actually, you are right. I talked to the owner, right? And he said that his finances are terrible and he's going bankrupt, right? But the fact that the town gossip said it isn't a particularly good reason to believe that it's true. Let's talk a bit about the structure of objections. There's a certain structure to objections. Consider the following example. Suppose that I make the following argument. It will be good for the students if we give them twice as many readings in ethnic studies classes. If we give them more readings, then they will be exposed to more information. If they are exposed to more information, then they will learn more. Learning is good. Now consider this objection. The author claims that more readings will provide more information. It's not necessarily true that more readings will provide more information. Sometimes readings are very repetitive. For example, textbook A and textbook B present pretty much the same material. Right? If we give them repetitive readings, then they will not really be getting more information. Let's look at what's involved in this example. First, we explain what part of the argument or theory we want to criticize. Let's call this identifying the target. Right? The target is always some part of the original argument. In this example, the target is the following claim. If we give them more readings, then they will be exposed to more information. In the objection, we identify the target by saying something like this. The author claims that more readings will provide more information. Next, we assert that the conclusion is false. Okay, so let's call this the counterclaim. It's not necessarily true that more readings will provide more information. The counterclaim will be the conclusion of the objection. Third, we give evidence that the counterclaim is true. Let's call this evidence for the counterclaim. Sometimes readings are very repetitive. Finally, we present warrant for the evidence. That is, we explain why the evidence creates a problem for the target. If we give them repetitive readings, then they won't really get more information. I'm emphasizing this because people tend to forget the first, second, and fourth parts. Right? They go straight to the evidence and leave it with the evidence. Right? They forget that they need to tell people what the evidence is evidence for. Right? That is, They neglect to tell people which part of the argument goes wrong and how. They also tend to forget to explain to the reader why their evidence is actually warrant for what they're trying to prove. Right? That is, they fail to explain why the evidence causes a reason to doubt part of the original argument. Right? Now, you want to avoid making that mistake. Right? So what you want to do is spell things out for the reader. Okay? So most of the time, right, you need to give explicit answers to 4 questions. Exactly what part of the argument has a problem? The target. In what way does the argument go wrong? Counterclaim. Is it false, or does it fail to prove what it's supposed to prove? What reason do you have for thinking that it actually does go wrong in the way you say that it does? That's evidence for the counterclaim. And finally, why should I believe that this so-called evidence actually does cause a problem for the argument? That's warrant for the evidence. So one way to think of this point is that you need to provide background information. Without knowing what your target is, the reader will have trouble understanding what you're getting at. Now, I might be able to figure it out. Why? Because I'm your teacher, I know the material well, and my job is to analyze arguments. But you can't assume that members of the general public will understand you. Right? It's your job to spell things out so that the reader does not get confused. So let me give you an example that I often use. Suppose that I were to tell you this. Right? There's a group that I talk about in my dissertation called the critical race theorists. Right? And they have proposed certain restrictions on racist speech. In particular, they've proposed that people should be able to sue, people who are victims of racial insults should be able to sue the people who deliver the racial insult. Now, part of their argument is that racial insults are a lot like fighting words. Let me give you an example that illustrates this point. It has to do with a court case called Chaplinsky. In my dissertation, right, I looked at a debate over government restrictions on racist speech. And in particular, I looked at some of the writings of a group called the critical race theorists. Right? Now, the critical race theorists had argued for various sorts of limitation on racist speech to protect people, to protect the victims. The ACLU at that time strongly disagreed. Right? So the head of the ACLU wrote some articles arguing that their proposals were too dangerous. They were a threat to free speech. Now, suppose that I give the following argument, drawing on the head of the ACLU, Nadine Strawson. The critical race theorists argue that racial insults are a lot like fighting words. Okay? Fighting words are words that by their very nature are prone to create extreme anger, violence, or distress, right, in the people who they're directed at. And so so that's their argument. Now, suppose I say this. Well, Strawson points out that the courts rarely cite Chaplinsky anymore. I expect you're confused. Right? But what if I spell this out? I say, okay, Strawson was trying to argue that even though they are like fighting words, right, the courts have moved away from saying that the government can restrict fighting words. As evidence for that, she pointed to Chaplinsky. Right? She pointed to the fact that the courts rarely cite Chaplinsky as a precedent. And Chaplinsky is the case that established that the government may put restrictions on fighting words. Now that's probably more clear. Right? Why is it more clear? Well, because now I filled in the background. I told you, okay, here's what Strawson is doing. Right? She's not saying they're not like fighting words. She's saying even though they are like fighting words, that doesn't necessarily prove what they want it to prove. Right? Then I explain why the courts rarely rely on Chaplinsky as a precedent anymore. And then I fill in why that causes a problem for their argument. Right? I say, and that's relevant because it was Chaplinsky that established that that the government could restrict fighting words. Now, if I were at a meeting of the ACLU and I said, the Supreme Court rarely relies on Chaplinsky anymore, everyone would be nodding their heads. Right? Or if I were in a group of free speech lawyers, whoever it is. Now, if I were in the philosophy department and I gave that argument without any context, people would look at me funny. There's a few people that would get it, right? We have a couple people that work on related areas, but most people would be like, what's Chaplinsky? I study abstract metaphysics, right? I don't study free speech issues. Right? So it would be inappropriate for me to walk in there and assume they're going to fill in all the gaps. Right? It's the same thing when you're writing a paper, right? You have to ask yourself, what do I need to fill in for my readers? And particularly, do I need to very clearly identify which part of the original argument I'm talking about and why the evidence that I'm going to present is a reason to disbelieve it. At this point, I need to make a reminder. An objection is not necessarily an argument for the claim that the conclusion of the original argument is false. Right? An objection is an argument for the claim that something is wrong with the original argument. Right? So consider the following discussion. The Cardinals are going to win the World Series. Olga, the telephone psychic, said so. That's not a good reason to believe that they will win the World Series. So you think they're not going to win the World Series? No, I believe that they're going to win the World Series. I just think that believing things because a telephone psychic says so is bad reasoning. Right? Actually, so I knew someone in college who'd worked during the summer as Olga, the telephone psychic. Right? She was not psychic. Right? She had a computer she typed things into. Right? But that was her job. Now notice here, right? Nina doesn't object to Martin's conclusion. She agrees with it. She thinks that Martin's argument for that conclusion is bad. Now, sometimes, right, we present objections to people's argument not because we disagree with their conclusion, but because we don't want them to be going around giving a bad argument for one reason or another. Right? Sometimes I find myself saying, oh, please don't embarrass us, those of us who agree with that position, by giving that argument for it. Right? That argument is so completely full of holes. You're going to discredit the position that you and I both agree with by going out and acting like that's one of the better arguments for it. Right? So what do? Well, you say to the person, look, here's why that argument doesn't work. And hopefully you say, and here's a better set of arguments for what you're trying to prove. I mean, sometimes I've even done that with people who I strongly disagree with, right? I'm like, okay, no, don't go there, right? There are a lot of good arguments for your position, right, that you can make, right? Don't waste your time with that one. Let's take a closer look at some of the types of counterclaims. Right? Once you've identified your target, there are two ways that you can present a counterclaim. First, you can argue that the target is not true. In the terms that we used in the other writing workshop, you can argue that there is not enough evidence for the claim. For example, consider the following argument. We will make more money if we increase pollution up to the legal limit. We are under the legal limit, therefore we should increase pollution. Now note that the conclusion, which is the third sentence, is based on two claims. We could challenge the truth of either of these two claims. For example, we could argue that the first claim is not true. We will not make more money if we increase pollution up to the legal limit. More efficient factories will make more money in the long run. Or we could argue that the second claim is not true. We are not under the legal limit. The county just passed a new ordinance that imposes stricter pollution controls, so we are currently right at the legal limit. I want you to notice the structure of the counterclaim in these examples. When you argue that some claim is not true, your counterclaim is basically claim X is not true. We could also argue that the target is unwarranted. That is, we could argue that the claim is not a good enough argument for the claim that it's supposed to prove. In the terms that we used earlier, you're asking for warrant for the first claim. For example, just because we will make more money does not mean that we should do it. We have no right to mistreat the local community in that way. Notice the structure of the counterclaim in this example. When you argue that a claim is unwarranted, your counterclaim is something like, claim X is not a good enough reason to believe claim Y. At this point, I want to connect this to something from a previous workshop. That is the workshop on argument structure. In that workshop, I said repeatedly that for an argument to be successful, two things have to be true. Right? First, right, the evidence actually has to be true. And second, it has to prove what it's supposed to prove. So when I say it rained last night, so the pavement must be wet, right, well, that argument only works if A, it rained last night, and B, the fact that it rained last night is a reason to believe that the pavement is wet. Right? So if a person wants to object to that, they can say one of two things. Right? Either it didn't rain last night, that is, the counterclaim would be that's not true. Right? Or the fact that it rained last night is not a good enough reason to believe that the pavement will be wet. Right? That's how it works with counterclaims. Once you've figured out what point in the argument you want to criticize, you've got to figure out, do you think that it's not true, or do you think that it doesn't prove what it's supposed to prove? Let's talk about some practical tips for presenting objections. When you present an objection, you need to set up the context for your reader. Usually, this means that you should do the following 5 things. First, state the main conclusion of the argument. For example, the author argues that the little girl never should have gone through the woods. Second, state the point that you want to criticize. As part of his argument, he says that it would only take an extra hour to get to her grandmother's house if she went around the woods. Third, explain what role it is supposed to play in the argument. And if it's evidence, what claim is it evidence for? It might be the claim is supposed to show that she could get to her grandmother's house on time without going through the woods. If it's warrant, which piece of evidence is it supposed to clarify, and what claim is that piece of evidence supposed to prove? The author had pointed out that she had 5 hours before she needed to get to her grandmother's house. The point about the path around the woods was supposed to explain why the other claim was a reason to believe that she could get to her grandmother's house on time without going through the woods. Right. Now, once you've done that, okay, which is essentially setting up your target, right, you signal the reader that you're going to present an objection. Right? So that's the 4th step. Signal the reader that you're going to present an objection. Now, you can often do that with one word, like however, comma, and then go into the sentence. Or you could say something like, I'm not sure that this is true, or I'm not sure that this proves what it's supposed to prove. There's a number of different ways you can do that. And then you state your counterclaim. However, it's not true that it would only take an extra hour. Or the fact that it would only take an extra hour does not show that you could get to her grandmother's house on time. Right? So, 5 things you need to do. State the main conclusion of the argument you're criticizing, state the point you want to criticize, explain what role it's supposed to play in the argument, signal the reader that you're going to present an objection, and state your counterclaim. Now that we've looked at the structure of objections and how to present objections, let's talk a little bit about other types of reply. The method I've given you for presenting objections also works pretty well for things like corroborations and sometimes for illustrations. Particularly if you want to say, hey, that person made a good point, and I'm going to give an additional reason to believe that they're correct, right? You would use a similar structure. Right? So let's broaden out that structure. Okay? Let me suggest 5 general steps for presenting a reply, not just objections. First, state the main conclusion of the argument. Right? So it might be, the author was arguing that the problem with the Phantom Menace was more than just the casting decisions. Then state the point that you want to comment on. Right? For example, as part of this argument, the author said that Ewan McGregor is a talented and accomplished actor. Right? Then explain the role that the statement was supposed to play in the argument. Right? His claim about Ewan McGregor was supposed to show that the reason that key climatic scenes fell flat was not only due to the lack of talent among the cast. Okay? Like the big fighting scene or the big confrontation between Obi-Wan and Anakin, right? Well, it's not just because Hayden Christensen's a terrible actor, right? There were other reasons that fell flat. Then state what kind of thing you're going to say about the argument. Now, you remember when I said you were talking when we were talking about objections, I said you can simply do that with something like however, right? Now, in a similar way, you need to show what kind of thing you're going to say about the argument, right? Are you going to give a reason to believe it's true? Are you going to give a further example of it, etc.? So, for example, you might say, there are several examples that demonstrate his talent, okay? That says, hey, that was a good point. Now I'm going to give you some examples that help illustrate the point. Or, we know this is true because, meaning, hey, he made this claim, it's right, and now I'm going to explain to you some additional reasons to believe that that's correct, if you weren't convinced already. And then state the main point of your reply, which is kind of the equivalent of the counterclaim. His performance in Mrs. Potter was excellent. Or, the awards and commendations that he received for other movies show, blah, 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 blah. Okay? So you see the basic idea, right? The idea is whenever you give a reply of any type to an argument, you want to do several things. You want to clearly identify what part of the argument you're talking about. You want to remind the reader of why that person was saying that thing. Right? You want to let them know very clearly what kind of thing you're going to say about it. Right? They shouldn't have to guess, is the thing that's going to come next another reason to believe it's true, a reason to believe it's false, an illustration, a clarification, etc. Right? You should make that clear to your reader. And then finally, right, you can start in with your reply. So what's the bottom line here? The bottom line is that I want you to practice these techniques when you give replies on the discussion board. Okay? So in this class, you're required to do 2 comments a week. They can be an original comment and a reply to someone else, or 2 replies to other people. Right? You get your choice. When you give your reply or replies, each time you do that, I'd like you to practice this technique. Right? Say, this person said this. Right? Here's why they were saying it. Here's the kind of thing I'm going to say about it, and here's what I have to say. So that's the main thing. Now, I would also like you to go on and try the exercises that are in this module. Okay? Each of the exercises, right? The exercises are ungraded, right? Now, they're video exercises, so I'll introduce it with a question, right, in video form, and then there'll be you'll have several choices of answer. Okay? Each one will have a response, right? If you get the wrong answer, right, try one of the others. Keep going till you get the right answer. Okay? And if you want to, you can go back and look at them again if you want to be a reminder of what was going on. Right? Again, they aren't graded, right? But I'd like you to do these exercises to get a better handle on what's going on here. Also, the final exercise will call for you to send something to me. If you want to, feel free. You don't have to, right? But if you do, I'll look at it and I'll have suggestions.